The night Sarah Coldwin turned 16, she stood alone in the clearing behind her father's house and waited for something that never came. Every other wolf-born child in Asheville pack had described it the same way: a pull, a heat beneath the skin, a sudden, almost painful awareness of the beast living inside them, stretching, waking, pushing to get out. Her cousin Lena had told her it felt like swallowing sunlight. Her childhood friend Owen had said it was like a door slamming open inside his chest, and everything he had ever been small about had suddenly felt enormous. Sarah stood in that clearing for 3 hours. The wind moved through the pine trees. An owl called twice from somewhere far off. The moon, full and low and heavy with cold light, watched her without any warmth at all. Nothing happened. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum, the way she had seen the younger children do when they were practicing, trying to feel the shape of their wolf. She felt her own heartbeat, steady, even, completely alone. She went back inside before dawn and told no one. For 2 more nights, she tried again. She stood in the clearing. She reached inward. She waited. She tried everything she had ever heard from older pack members. She held her breath. She let it go slowly. She closed her eyes and imagined herself running on 4 legs through dark forest. She pressed her palms to the earth and tried to feel the pack bond humming through the ground, the way her teachers said it would. Nothing. On the 4th morning, her father called her into the main room of their house. His name was Aldrich Coldwin, and he was Asheville's beta. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a pack man through and through, which meant that his pride and his duty, and his sense of what was right, were all tangled together in a way that left very little room for anything soft. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It took her a moment to name it. It was shame. He did not ask her what happened. He already knew. The pack elder, a thin woman named Cora who smelled like old smoke and pine resin, had come to the house the night before. She had the ability to sense the wolf bond in every pack member. She had stood in the doorway and looked at Sarah for a long moment and said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. Aldrich cleared his throat. "You understand what this means," he said. Sarah sat very still. "I understand what people will say it means." He looked at the table. "It is the same thing." It was not the same thing, but Sarah did not argue, because she could see in his face that arguing would cost him something he was not willing to spend. He was already arranging his grief into something he could carry in public without being seen to carry it. She recognized the process. She had watched him do it after her mother left, 4 years ago, in the middle of a cold February that never seemed to fully end. She did not cry. She sat at that table and looked at the knot in the wood near the center edge, a dark swirling mark she had stared at through hundreds of breakfast meals, and she kept her breathing steady, and she did not cry. "People will call you hollow," her father said. His voice had gone flat. "There is no way around that. You were born into this pack. You are my daughter. That makes it harder, not easier." Sarah already knew the word. Everyone in every wolf pack knew the word. Hollow. Born without a wolf soul. No beast inside, no pack bond, no place in the hierarchy. It was not just an insult. It was a legal and social designation. A hollow person could not hold rank, could not vote in pack decisions, could not train with the warriors, could not eat at the high table during pack ceremonies, could not, technically, own property once they came of age. She was 16 years old, and her entire future had just been rearranged into something unrecognizable. She did not cry. "I will manage," she said. Her father looked at her then, really looked at her, for what felt like the last time in a long while. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might, under different circumstances, have been love. Then he looked away again, and the moment closed. Within a week, everyone in Asheville knew. The pack had nearly 300 members spread across a valley and the lower slopes of the mountains that boxed it in on 3 sides. In a community that small, a secret was not something that survived. News traveled through Asheville the way water travels through rock, finding every crack, pooling in every low place. By the time Sarah walked to the market square on a Saturday morning 6 days after her failed shift, she could feel the change in the air the moment people saw her. Some of them looked away quickly. That was almost kind. Others did not bother. They watched her with expressions ranging from pity to open satisfaction. There were people in every pack who quietly enjoyed the misfortune of others, not because they were evil, but because it made them feel safer about their own position. Someone falling below you was almost like rising above them. A girl her age named Clara, who had always been pleasant to Sarah in the thoughtless way that people are pleasant when they have nothing to gain or lose from it, walked past without speaking, not rudely, just without speaking. Sarah understood. Clara had a rank to protect, a future that could be damaged by association. The pack elder Cora assigned Sarah her new duties within the month: washing, cleaning the pack hall after large gatherings, hauling water, tending the storage rooms, helping in the kitchens during festival preparations. Sarah accepted each task without a word. She was efficient, and she was thorough, and she learned quickly. And after a while, the women she worked alongside stopped watching her with caution and started simply treating her as another pair of hands. It was not friendship, but it was workable. Her father grew quieter each month. He stopped eating dinner at the family table and began taking meals at the pack hall instead. He did not forbid her from the house, but she understood that her presence in it had become a kind of weight for him. She started spending more of her hours in the small woodshed behind the house, which she cleaned out and made into a private space for herself. She hung a piece of old wool over the single window to keep the cold out, and kept a candle burning at night. She read everything she could find. Ashvale had a small library in the back room of the pack hall, mostly old records and hunting maps, and a few thick volumes of pack law. She read them all. She read the agricultural guides. She read the old stories that the pack elders had written down generations ago, accounts of the early days of the pack, the founding, the wars with neighboring territories, the long cold winters when everything nearly collapsed. She read about the moon cycle and the way it affected wolf temperament and strength. She read about herbs and their uses. She was determined not to disappear. One evening, roughly 3 months into her new life, she was hauling a bucket of water from the well near the eastern edge of the pack grounds when she slipped on wet stone and cut her palm on the edge of the bucket handle. It was not a deep cut, but it bled freely. She pressed her other hand over it and looked down and went very still. The blood pooling in her palm was not red. It was silver. Not silver the way old metal looks in dim light. Truly, purely silver, like liquid moonlight held in the cup of her hand. It caught the last of the evening sun and threw tiny scattered lights across the stone around her feet. She stared at it. Her heart, which had been beating calmly for months through every humiliation and every loss, suddenly hammered hard against her ribs. She closed her fingers quickly. She looked around. No one was near. She walked back to her woodshed with her hand pressed closed, and her head down, and her breathing deliberate and careful. She sat on her wooden stool and opened her palm slowly, alone, by candlelight. The blood was still silver. By morning, the cut had closed. The blood had dried into a thin line along her palm that caught the light strangely for 2 days before fading entirely. She did not tell anyone. She did not know what it meant, and until she knew, silence felt like the only protection she had. She began to pay closer attention to herself. She noticed that she healed from small injuries faster than made sense. A bruise she earned hauling a heavy beam across the pack hall yard should have lasted a week. It was gone, in 2 days. A blister from a too-hot pot handle healed overnight. She tested it carefully, never deliberately hurting herself but watching the small accidents that came with hard physical work. She also noticed that animals behaved strangely around her. The pack's working dogs, which were trained to heel to ranked pack members and ignore or growl at hollows, approached her quietly, with their heads lowered and their ears soft. Not submission exactly, something more like recognition. She did not know what to make of it. She was careful not to make it strange. She did not reach for them. She let them come and go. But at night, alone in her woodshed with her candle and her books, she turned these observations over and over in her mind, like stones she could not yet read the meaning of. The years passed the way years pass for someone who has decided to survive. Not easily, but steadily. Sarah grew into herself quietly. She was not tall, but she was strong from the work, and she had her mother's dark eyes and a particular stillness about her that some people found unsettling, and others, the ones paying closer attention, found interesting. She was not friendless. An older woman named Berta, who ran the pack kitchen, had a sharp tongue and a warm heart, and had decided within the first year that Sarah was worth something, and that was that. Berta saved her the best cuts of the daily meal without making a ceremony of it, And when pack law changed to allow hollows to use the pack library freely, Berta was the one who pointed it out to Sarah before anyone else. There was also a boy, 2 years younger than Sarah, named Gil, who worked in the stables. Gil had a mild speech delay that made other young people his age impatient with him, and he had found in Sarah a person who was willing to wait and listen without any visible desire to be somewhere else. They ate lunch together in the stable yard most days and talked about horses and weather and the things they read. These were small things, but Sarah had learned that small things were the difference between a life that worked and one that did not. She was 21 when everything changed. She was in the middle of carrying a split length of firewood across the pack yard when she heard the horn. It was the pack's formal horn, the deep brass one that hung in the watchtower, and was only sounded for one of 3 reasons: a threat at the border, a death in the Alpha family, or the arrival of someone so significant that the pack needed a moment to compose itself. She looked up toward the eastern gate. Riders were coming through. 12 of them, mounted on animals that were larger and darker than anything Ashvale's stables kept. Each rider wore a dark covering with a simple iron emblem at the chest. No bright colors, no ceremony, just weight and purpose. The kind of procession that did not need decoration, because the thing it announced decorated itself. Behind the lead riders, on a horse that matched the rest in color but somehow moved differently, with more controlled power, as if the animal knew it was carrying something that demanded more precision than speed, rode a single figure. He was not dressed differently from his men. That was the first thing she noticed. He wore the same dark covering, the same plain iron at his chest. He was not adorned. He was not performing. He simply sat in that saddle with a quality she could not immediately name, the quality of someone who had never, in their entire life, needed to announce what they were. Someone behind her whispered the name, and it moved through the assembled pack like a cold wind through an open window. Calum Voss, the Alpha King. Sarah stood where she was with the firewood in her arms, and watched him ride through the gates of Ashvale. His gaze moved across the assembled pack, the way a person reads a room when they walk into it, not looking for anything specific, but missing nothing. It swept the crowd with a calm, measuring quality that had no warmth in it whatsoever. For one single moment, that gaze crossed her. He did not stop. He did not slow. He looked away a half-second later as if she were simply another stone in the wall. But something happened, something she would not have been able to explain to anyone, even if she had wanted to. The silver beneath her skin, which had been quiet and dormant for 5 years, shifted. It was the only word she had for it, like something sleeping in deep water, disturbed by the shadow of a boat passing above. Sarah looked down at her hands. Nothing visible. The firewood was still in her arms. The crowd around her was already moving, parting, making space for the Alpha King and his riders. She turned away and carried her firewood to the storage shed and stacked it with the rest, piece by piece, in the careful, methodical way she did everything now. But her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. Calum Voss had been Alpha King for 9 years, and in those 9 years, not one pack in the 12 territories had made the mistake of underestimating him twice. He had taken the title at the age of 24, under circumstances that most packs still did not discuss openly. Not because the facts were hidden, but because the facts were uncomfortable. The previous Alpha King had been his uncle, a man named Draven who had ruled through a combination of fear, strategic alliances, and a particular talent for making problems disappear before they became public. Draven had been effective, which was not the same thing as being good. Calum had removed him from power in a single night, legally, through pack law, using a clause in the original covenant of packs that allowed a direct male heir to challenge for the kingship if the ruling Alpha could be proven to have broken 3 fundamental laws of wolf governance. Draven had broken 5. The challenge lasted 11 minutes. Calum had been Alpha King ever since, and he was harder and colder than his uncle in some ways, and entirely different in others. He did not make problems disappear. He stood them in front of the council, and named them plainly, and dealt with them where everyone could see. He did not take pleasure in demonstrating his power. He exercised it with the same flat efficiency that a craftsman applies to a tool, because it was necessary, because it was his, and because sentiment in a king was something an entire people paid for. The reason for his visit to Ashvale was simple. Intelligence had reached his court that 3 packs in the Western Mountain region were quietly coordinating, sharing resources, communication, and possibly warriors, outside the sanctioned council structure. That kind of coordination was not automatically illegal, but combined with certain other signals his scouts had identified, it warranted a personal inspection. Ashvale was one of the three. He sat across from Ashvale's alpha, a heavy man named Gregor whose authority rested mostly on heredity and physical size, rather than any particular quality of mind, and listened to 3 hours of explanations that contradicted each other in 4 places. Calum did not point out the contradictions, he noted them. He asked 3 simple questions. He watched Gregor's hands while the man answered, the way a very good reader watches a speaker's face without looking directly at the eyes. When the meeting ended, Calum stood, nodded once, and said that his scouts would remain in Ashvale for 4 days of routine inspection. Gregor thanked him with visible relief, which told Calum everything he needed to know. His men set up in the guest quarters at the pack hall. Calum took the single private room at the end of the east corridor, not because he required comfort, but because he required privacy for the work he did at night, reviewing reports, writing assessments, preparing the legal arguments he would need if the inspection turned up what he suspected. He did not sleep much, he never had. On the evening of the first day, he walked the perimeter of the pack grounds alone. This was his habit in every pack he visited. He walked the edges, the parts people forgot about when they were preparing for an important guest, the storage yards and the worker quarters, and the places where the ground told you what the people did not. He had learned more from the condition of a pack's firewood pile than from any formal report. He was crossing the back quadrant of the storage yard when he heard voices. He moved without thinking to a position where he could see without being immediately visible. This was also a habit. Not deception exactly. Just the behavior of a man who had learned that what people said when they thought no one important was listening was considerably more useful than what they said when they were performing for an audience. 2 older women were working by the kitchen door, pulling finished loaves from a wide cooling shelf. Their voices were low but carried in the cold evening air. She looked at him. "Berta, did you see her face?" "I saw everyone's face. It was a remarkable arrival." "No, but she specifically. There was something strange about it." A short pause, the sound of bread being moved. "Leave the girl alone, Marin. I'm not saying anything unkind. I'm saying something strange. There is a difference."
"Not in this pack, there isn't."
Calum almost moved on. What stopped him was not the words themselves, but the particular quality of the first woman's voice when she said the word strange. He had spent 9 years listening to people describe other people, and there were many different reasons a person used that word. This woman's voice had none of the usual reasons behind it. It was not gossip. It was not cruelty. It sounded, very specifically, like the voice of someone who had seen something they could not file away in any existing category. He moved on without approaching them. The next morning, he watched the pack resume its ordinary routine from the window of his room. Below in the main yard, workers moved through the morning tasks. He was not looking for anything specific. He was simply watching, in the way he always watched, accumulating details. He saw the girl from the day before. She was carrying water, 2 large buckets on a wooden pole across her shoulders, moving across the yard at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but simply efficient. She was not a large person, but she moved with a kind of grounded confidence that was different from the careful, slightly watchful movement of the other workers he could see. She was not watching for him. She was not watching for anyone. She was simply doing what she had come to do, and her full attention was on doing it well. His wolf, which had been quiet for 3 years, made a sound inside him. Not loud, not clear, more like something rolling over in its sleep. He ignored it. He turned back to his reports. On the second day, the Alpha Gregor organized a formal pack gathering in the main courtyard, the kind of structured social event that packs put together to demonstrate health and cohesion when they were being watched. There was food prepared at long tables, and the pack's musicians played in the corner, and the senior warriors demonstrated a training exercise in the open space near the gate. Calum stood slightly apart from the proceedings and observed. He noted that the girl was not at the formal tables. She was moving along the edge of the yard with a basket, collecting used cups and plates, one of the serving roles assigned to the lowest-ranked members of any pack. She worked without looking up at the gathered families, not resentfully, without bitterness, as far as he could tell, simply focused. He watched her for roughly 3 minutes, and then looked away. Gregor appeared at his shoulder, talking about the trading arrangements with the Southern Valley packs, which Calum listened to with one part of his attention, while the other part continued processing what his scouts had filed that morning. The reports were not good. 3 storage rooms in Ashvale had supplies at levels that did not match their official records. Someone in this pack was diverting goods. That meant money was moving somewhere that it should not be, and money moving in the wrong direction, in Calum's experience, always had a destination worth knowing about. He was in the middle of mentally drafting his response to the supply discrepancy when the noise hit. It was not one sound. It was a cascade of sounds. A crash at the eastern wall. A high, tearing snarl that was clearly not a trained wolf sound, not a controlled shift. And then screaming, not panicked screaming, but the particular sharp shouts of trained warriors, suddenly confronted with something that required immediate action. Calum was moving before anyone around him had processed what was happening. The creature that had come through the eastern wall was large. It had been a wolf once. He could see that in the shape of it, but something had gone wrong in its structure in a way that made looking at it slightly disorienting, the way a word looks wrong when you stare at it too long. It moved with a frantic, lurching energy that spoke of pain and wrongness rather than aggression. Its eyes, when Calum caught a flash of them, were not the golden orange of a natural shift. They were dark and clouded, the color of water at the bottom of a deep hole. The pack warriors had formed a loose ring around it at distance, calling to each other in clipped tones, trying to contain without engaging. This was correct procedure for a rogue encounter, which meant Ashvale's warrior training was at least adequate. But the creature was not behaving like a rogue. It was behaving like something that had been sent with a specific direction in mind, because it kept orienting toward the center of the crowd, toward the highest concentration of people, with a deliberateness that made Calum's jaw tighten. He was calculating the fastest angle of approach when it happened. The creature lunged, not toward the warriors. It had identified, in whatever broken reasoning it still had, a gap, and it took it, launching itself toward the open space between 2 warrior positions where a small cluster of pack civilians had not yet cleared. The girl was right in the gap. She had been moving toward the wall with her basket when the creature oriented toward her and launched. There was no time. The warriors were already shouting, already moving, but the distance was wrong. She turned. She saw it coming. And then she dropped the basket, spread both hands flat in front of her, and something happened that Calum, who had seen a very great deal in 9 years of ruling 12 wolf territories, had never seen in his life. Light came out of her hands. It was silver, the exact color of moonlight on still water, but concentrated, solid, purposeful. It shot out from both palms in a wide arc and struck the creature squarely in the chest. The sound it made when it hit was not a sound so much as a sensation, a pressure in the air that Calum felt in his sternum from 30 feet away. The creature dropped. Not slowly, not with any drama. It went from full motion to completely still in the space of a breath, like a candle going out. The yard was absolutely silent. Sarah stood where she was, with both hands still raised, and her breathing hard, and her eyes wide, and Calum saw it then, the detail that sealed everything. Her right palm had a cut on it, a small one, from the edge of the basket handle she had dropped, and from that cut, blood was running down her wrist. Silver blood. He had read about it. Once when he was 19 years old, in a text so old that the pages had been reinforced with a kind of transparent material to keep them from crumbling. A text stored in the deepest part of the royal archive that his council elder had showed him during his first year as king, with the specific note that this was history, and not a thing that existed in the modern world. Silver blood. The original bloodline. The root line. The line that predated every pack structure currently in existence, and that was, according to every historical record he had ever read, completely extinct. He looked at her. She was looking at her own hand. She had not yet looked up to see what he was doing. She was looking at the silver on her wrist with an expression that contained many things, and one of them, he noted with sharp focus, was recognition. This was not the first time she had seen her own blood run that color. She had known. She had been keeping it. He spoke 2 words to his head guard, the man named Harlow who stood always at his left shoulder. Bring her. Harlow crossed the yard in 12 long strides, and Sarah looked up from her hand, just in time to see him coming. She did not run. She did not argue. She looked across the yard at Calum, who stood watching her, with an expression that gave nothing away, And she held that look for a moment that lasted longer than its actual duration. Then she lowered her hands and waited for Harlow to reach her. Calum watched this and said nothing further. He turned to Gregor, who was standing approximately 4 feet to his left, with the face of a man who was trying to decide which response would cost him least. "Do you know what she is?" Calum asked him, quietly enough that only Gregor could hear. Gregor's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the girl, then at the creature lying motionless on the stones, then at the silver light that was already fading from the air where it had struck. "She is hollow," Gregor said. "She was designated hollow at 16. She has no wolf." Calum looked at the creature on the ground. Then he looked at the girl, who was now standing beside Harlow, waiting. "No," he said. "She has something considerably older." He walked across the yard without further explanation, and his guard closed around him, and around Sarah, and before the crowd of assembled Ashvale pack members had fully recovered the ability to speak, they were moving through the eastern gate and into the open road beyond the pack walls. Sarah's hands had stopped shaking by the time they reached the horses. She moved to the animal Harlow indicated, and mounted with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years working in stables, and Calum, swinging up onto his own horse beside her, noticed this, and filed it away with the other things he was noticing about her. She did not look back at Ashvale. He did not ask her to. He simply urged his horse forward, and the procession moved, and the mountain pack grew smaller behind them against the pines, and Sarah Coldwin, who had been hollow for 5 years and invisible for most of her life, rode away from it without a single word of farewell, and something in that silence, the quality of it, the completeness of it, told Calum more than any explanation could have. She had already been leaving for years. Today she had simply gotten on the horse. The Iron Keep appeared at the end of a valley that felt like it had been designed to make everything approaching it feel smaller. The mountains on either side were close enough and steep enough that the sky between them was a narrow strip of gray, and the road ran straight as a ruled line toward the fortress walls, which were black with age and thick enough that Sarah guessed 3 people could walk abreast along the top of them. The gate towers were not ornamented. There were no banners. There was only stone and iron, and the cold, deliberate statement that this place had been built not to impress, but to hold. They had ridden for most of the day. Calum did not speak to her during the journey, and she did not speak to him. His guard rode around them in a loose diamond formation, close enough to respond to anything but not crowding. Harlow, the head guard, occasionally fell back to check the rear of the column, and then returned to his position. He was a large man, with a plain, weathered face, and the kind of body that had been built by actual use rather than demonstration. Sarah used the ride to observe what she could. She was good at gathering information from available materials. 5 years of living at the edges of Ashvale's society had trained her to pull meaning from details that others did not notice or bother to collect. She watched the riders around her, the way they moved, the way they communicated with each other through small, compressed signals, a tilt of the head, the angle of a shoulder, 2 fingers raised or dropped. They were trained together, not just trained individually. That was a unit with genuine history. These were men who had been through difficult things side by side, and it showed in the lack of wasted movement between them. She watched Calum, from slightly behind and to the right, which was where the horses naturally placed her in relation to him. He rode the way he had entered Ashvale, with that contained quality, nothing unnecessary, nothing spent without purpose. He reviewed documents in his saddle without slowing his horse, passing each page to Harlow when he was done. He did not fidget. He did not scan the horizon with the slightly anxious frequency of someone checking for threats. He had processed the threat landscape, apparently, and found it manageable, and had moved on to other work. She thought about what he had said to her alpha before they left. She has something considerably older. He knew what she was, or he knew something at least, more than she did. That sat in her chest like a coal throughout the ride. The Iron Keep opened to receive them with an efficiency that told her this was not an unusual return. The inner yard was large and organized, with stables to the left and a series of low stone buildings to the right that had the look of workrooms. Straight ahead was the main hall, 3 stories of dark stone with windows that were narrow and practical rather than decorative. People came out to meet the horses, pack staff and handlers, and 2 individuals whose manner suggested some kind of administrative role. No ceremony, no formation. Everyone moved quickly and purposefully, and then the horses were being handed off, and the column was dispersing, and Harlow appeared at Sarah's elbow, with the quiet presence of someone who had done this particular task before. "I will show you your room," he said. Not unkindly, not warmly either, simply as a statement of what was going to happen next. She followed him. The room he led her to was on the second level of a side building, connected to the main hall by a covered walkway. It was not large, but it had a proper window and a real bed, with 2 heavy blankets and a washstand with a clean basin. There was a small table, with a chair, and a candle, already lit. The floor was cold stone, covered with a braided rug that was old but not worn through. Compared to her woodshed in Ashevale, it was a palace. "You will not be locked in," Harlow said, standing at the door. "But I would recommend staying in this building tonight. The keep is large and the layout is not obvious. You will receive food at the evening meal. Someone will come for you." "And tomorrow?" Sarah asked. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was used to answering questions from people who were not entitled to ask them, and who had developed a policy of neither indulging nor punishing the habit. "The Alpha King will speak to you when he is ready." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a long moment. Then she stood, washed her face and hands in the basin, checked the cut on her palm, which had already nearly closed, and sat back down. She was not afraid. She recognized the sensation she was feeling, and it was not fear. It was the particular alertness of someone who had entered a new situation with incomplete information, and was now in the business of filling in the gaps. She had been doing that for 5 years. She was, by now, quite skilled at it. The food that arrived an hour later was brought by a quiet girl named Nell, perhaps 14, who carried the tray with careful attention and set it on the table without making eye contact. Sarah thanked her. Nell looked briefly surprised and then nodded and left. The food was plain and ample. Bread, a bowl of something hot with vegetables and meat, a cup of water, a second cup with something warm that smelled like herbs. Sarah ate slowly, tasting everything. The cooking was confident and functional, the kind produced by people who fed a lot of people regularly and knew how to make quantity without losing quality. She ate all of it. She did not sleep immediately. She sat at the table and listened to the sounds of the keep settling into its night rhythms. Footsteps in the corridor above, the sound of something mechanical, a pulley perhaps, in the yard outside. Voices at a distance, 2 men talking about something she could not make out. The whole place breathed, with the particular sound of a location inhabited by many people who all knew their function. She woke to gray light through the narrow window, and was already sitting up when the knock came at her door. It was not Harlow. It was a man she had not seen before, older, with thin white hair, and a long robe of a dark gray that had seen considerable use. He carried a satchel over one shoulder, and looked at her over the tops of small wire-framed lenses perched near the end of his nose. "You are the girl," he said. "Sarah," she said. "I am Elder Marin. I am the Keep's head scholar, and the Alpha King's council archivist." He said this with the air of someone who said it frequently, and had not yet grown tired of how it sounded. "I am going to need to take a small blood sample." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the Alpha King would like to understand what you are before he speaks to you, and the fastest path to that understanding runs through me." He patted his satchel. "It will not hurt significantly." She considered this. "If I say no?" He tilted his head. "Then I suppose I will go back and tell him that, and the timeline for your conversation with him will extend somewhat." A pause. "I do not think extended time in this room, pleasant as it is, would be your preference." He was right. She held out her hand. The sample was small, drawn with a thin glass instrument she had not seen before, and the moment it touched the collection vial, the silver color was immediately visible to both of them. Elder Marin made a sound that was barely audible and immediately controlled, but she had been watching his face, and she saw what crossed it before he arranged his expression back into professional neutrality. It was not surprise. It was something more complicated. The face of a person who has spent a long time believing something was impossible, and has just found it looking back at them from a glass vial. "Have you always known?" he asked, quietly. "That it's silver?" "No. I discovered it about 5 years ago." "And the light? The force you used yesterday?" "That was the first time anything like that happened." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the vial. "Extraordinary," he said. so softly that she was not certain he intended her to hear it. He left quickly after that. She heard his footsteps moving away down the corridor, at a pace considerably faster than the one he had arrived with. She waited. It was not until late afternoon that Harlow came again and took her to the Alpha King. Calum's working room was on the top level of the main hall, and it looked exactly like what it was. The room of someone who worked constantly. Every surface had something on it. Maps, documents, bound reports with markers sticking out at various angles. 2 separate writing tables, each positioned near a window. A large board on the wall, with territorial lines, drawn in multiple colors. A fireplace, with a low fire, that was functional, rather than atmospheric. He was standing at one of the windows when she entered. He did not turn immediately. She stood in the center of the room, and did not fidget, and did not speak. When he did turn, he looked at her directly, in the way that people who spend a great deal of time being in charge learn to look at things. Full attention, no performance, no warmth offered as a social courtesy. "Sit," he said. She sat in the chair that had clearly been placed there for this purpose. He did not sit. He stayed on his feet, which was a choice, and she noted it. "Elder Marin has a theory," he said. "He will explain it to you fully, when he has confirmed the evidence more thoroughly. But the essential claim is this. You are not hollow. You are silver-blooded. Do you know what that means?" "No," she said. "It means you are descended from a lineage that predates every pack structure currently existing in the 12 territories. It means the power in your blood is not less than what a standard wolfborn carries. It is older, and, according to the texts Marin is currently pulling from the archive, considerably more significant." He said all of this in the same flat, informational tone that he might have used to explain a supply route or a change in territorial law. She watched him while he spoke, and found it interesting that he did not seem to be trying to impress her or frighten her. He was simply delivering information as he had received it, which was, in her experience, the most useful thing a person in authority could do. "What do you intend to do with that information?" she asked. A pause. The first one. It was short, but it was real. "I have not yet decided." That is an honest answer. I prefer honest answers. They save time. She looked at him for a moment. The creature that came through the wall at Ashvale. It was sent. It was not a question. He treated it like the observation it was. "Yes. By whom, and for what purpose, I am currently working to determine." "Was it sent for me specifically?" Another pause, shorter than the first. "That is one of the questions I need to answer." She nodded. She found that she was not frightened by this possibility. She was simply filing it alongside everything else she was accumulating. "You have no wolf," he said, not cruelly. Flatly, as a confirmed fact. "I have something older. That is what you said." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully categorize. It was not respect, not yet. It was not dismissal. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, making a small internal adjustment to a model he had already built, because a new data point did not fit the existing structure. "Yes," he said, "that is what I said." She held his gaze. "Then I would like Elder Marin to explain what that means as soon as he is able, and in the meantime, I would like something to read." The recalibration in his expression shifted by a fraction. "Harlow will arrange both," he said. He turned back to his window, which was, she understood, a dismissal. She stood. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he spoke again, without turning. "Your blood sample. Marin will need it for several days of testing." "He can have what he needs," she said. She left. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back briefly to the cold stone wall and let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. Her thinking was clear. She was in the fortress of the most powerful ruler in the known wolf world, brought there by force, with no rank and no allies, holding a secret she did not yet fully understand. And somehow, underneath all of that, something in her that had been waiting for a very long time felt, for the first time, like it was in the right place. She pushed off the wall and followed the corridor toward the library Elder Marin had already sent word to open for her. Elder Marin's archive was in the lowest level of the main hall, below the working rooms and the sleeping quarters and the council chambers, in a part of the keep where the stone walls were so old they had absorbed centuries of cold into their cores. The air down there smelled of dry paper and something mineral, like the inside of a cave that had never let water in. Sarah noticed that the cold did not particularly bother her, which was interesting because it was deep enough down here that her breath was visible, even with 2 oil lamps lit. She had been given the run of the main collection, which occupied 3 long rooms connected by low doorways, with shelving built directly into the stone walls, and additional freestanding shelves in the centers of each room, all carefully labeled in a handwriting so small and precise, it must have taken extraordinary patience to produce. Some of the labels were in the common tongue, some were in older dialects she recognized from the books in Ashvale's small library. A few were in something she did not know at all, symbols rather than letters, geometric and deliberate. She started with the books she could read, and moved carefully through the sections most relevant to what she needed. Pack history, bloodline records, the history of the 12 territories before they became 12 territories, when they were smaller, and more numerous, and governed by older customs. She read for most of the first night, sitting on a stool she had dragged to the shelf nearest the better of the 2 lamps, ignoring the cold, ignoring the hour, filling in the background of the world she had been living in, without ever fully understanding. He was carrying a fresh lamp and a thick volume under one arm, and looked, if anything, more awake than he had the previous afternoon. Some people, Sarah had observed over the years, were genuinely energized by the discovery of important things, and for Marin, important things apparently lived primarily in books and blood samples. "You did not sleep," he said, setting his lamp on the table nearest the door. "Neither did you," she said. He made a small acknowledging sound. He set the thick volume on the table, and opened it to a page that had been marked with a strip of dark cloth, and he turned the book toward her. The page held a drawing, old, careful, done in ink that had faded to a warm brown. It showed a woman standing in what looked like an open field, both arms raised slightly at her sides, with lines radiating from her hands in a pattern that looked, unmistakably, like the light that had come from Sarah's palms in the Ashvale courtyard. Beneath the drawing, text in the older dialect, which Sarah had been reading long enough that night to follow now, if slowly. She bent over the book and read. The woman in the drawing was referred to as the First Mother. The text described her in terms that were clearly as much legend as history, the kind of account that had been passed down so many times before anyone thought to write it, that the original facts were inseparable now from the story that had grown up around them. But certain details were consistent and specific enough to suggest they were rooted in something real. She had carried the blood of all wolves, not a single wolf, not a pack bond, but something that was more fundamental than both. She had been the living point of origin for the pack system, the anchor from which the bonds between wolves had originally radiated. Her blood had been silver. Her hands had produced light that could repel, bind, or release, depending on the intention behind it. She had been the only one of her kind, according to the legend. And then a later page, marked separately, with a note in Marin's small, precise handwriting, not the only one. The line continued. Hidden. Hunted. Sarah straightened from the book. Her back ached from hours on the stool. "How many survived?" she asked. Marin sat down in the chair across the table from her, lacing his fingers together on top of another book he had brought. "That is the question I have been working on since yesterday afternoon. The historical record is deeply incomplete, for reasons that the record itself makes clear." He paused. Silver-blooded individuals were systematically targeted for approximately 2 centuries, beginning roughly 400 years ago. The effort was not formal. It was not a declared campaign. It was the kind of quiet, distributed elimination that leaves very little paperwork. Killed, Sarah said, or forced to hide so thoroughly that they effectively ceased to exist as a known lineage. He looked at her steadily. "Until yesterday, I would have told you, based on everything in this archive, that the line was completely gone. I had no reason to believe otherwise." She looked at the drawing again. The woman in it was not depicted as remarkable in any physical way. She was ordinary looking, just standing in a field with her arms slightly raised, with light coming from her hands. "My mother," Sarah said. "She had been turning this over since the Ashvale courtyard. She left when I was 12. She did not leave. She ran." She said this not as something she was working out for the first time, but as something she was confirming aloud for the first time. Whatever she was, she knew someone was coming. Marin did not respond immediately. He opened the book in front of him to a specific page. "Your father's name was Aldrich Coldwin." Your mother's name, before she came to Ashevale, was Nora Wells. Do you know where she came from? She said she came from the Eastern Valley Packs. She never spoke about her family. She came from the Eastern Valley Packs via a route that covered her actual origin considerably. He turned the book toward her. It was a registry, an old one, names and dates in columnar format. He pointed to a line halfway down the page. Her original name was Nora Cavell. The Cavell line is one of 4 families identified in these records as likely carriers of silver blood. They were listed approximately 200 years ago as probably extinct. A pause. Apparently they were not. Sarah looked at the name. Nora Cavell. Her mother, rendered into ink on a page written before either of them was born, connected by blood and secrecy, and a survival instinct strong enough to carry across generations. She reached out and touched the page very lightly with her fingertip. The Alpha King, she said, pulling her hand back. How much of this does he know? He knows the essential outline. He knows what the silver blood designation means historically. He does not yet know the full scope of what the texts say about its capabilities, because I have not yet finished reading them myself. Marin's expression was careful. He is an intelligent man who makes rapid assessments, which is useful in a ruler, and occasionally challenging in other contexts. I would recommend telling him what you learn as you learn it. Because if I do not, he will assume I am strategizing against him. Yes. Fair. She stood, stretching carefully. What does this mean then? For me, practically. Marin folded his hands again. That is a larger question than I can answer today. But I can tell you what the texts suggest, and you can form your own view. He pulled the marked volume back toward himself. The silver-blooded were not simply powerful individuals. They were, according to the oldest accounts, a kind of living stabilizer for pack bonds. Their presence in a territory historically correlated with reduced conflict, stronger pack cohesion, faster healing of bond breaks after trauma. When the last of the line disappeared, approximately 300 years ago, the records show a measurable increase in territorial conflict across the known packs within 2 generations. She looked at him. You are saying I am not a weapon. I am saying you are something more useful and considerably more inconvenient than a weapon, he said. A weapon can be pointed. What you are cannot. She thought about this for the rest of the morning. Harlow appeared at the archive doorway around midday to tell her that the Alpha King had requested her at the evening meal. Not the formal hall, the working room. She nodded and went back to her reading. When she arrived at his working room that evening, the table in the corner had been cleared of documents and set with 2 plates and a covered dish. Calum was already at his desk, reviewing something, and he looked up when she entered with the same complete, impersonal attention he gave everything. He indicated the table with a brief gesture, and she sat. He crossed the room and sat across from her. He poured water into both cups himself, which she noted. He lifted the cover from the dish. Food, plain and ample, the same quality as what had been brought to her room. Marin tells me you have been in the archive since before dawn, he said. I find it difficult to stop reading when I have started something I need to understand. And do you understand it? I understand more than I did yesterday. She looked at him. I understand that what I carry is historically significant. I understand that people have been killed for carrying it. And I understand that the creature at Ashevale was not a coincidence. She paused. I do not yet understand who sent it. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again. The Iron Jaw Syndicate. They are an organized coalition of packs in the Northern Territories, operating outside council authority. We have been tracking their activities for 18 months. He said this without lowering his voice or softening the information, which she recognized as a decision, a choice to be direct rather than protective, and she found that she appreciated it considerably more than any form of careful management would have given her. They know about silver blood. They know about it, and they have been looking for it. A silver blood's capabilities can be used in specific ways that the syndicate's leadership finds interesting. His expression did not change, but something behind it went colder. Ways that require the silver blood to be considerably less than willing. She let that settle without visibly reacting. So they sent the creature to Ashevale. Yes, we believe they had intelligence suggesting something unusual was in that pack. They may have tracked your mother's line. It is a working theory. He set down his fork. The fact that you used your power in public, in front of a gathering that large, will have confirmed what they suspected before their intelligence was reliable enough to act on. So now they know for certain. Yes. She picked up her own fork. And you brought me here. Where I can control the perimeter, he said, without any indication that he expected her to find this anything other than reasonable. She did not find it unreasonable. She found it honest, which was not always the same thing as comfortable, but was considerably more useful. I am not a prisoner, she said, not as a challenge, as a request for clarification. He looked at her for a moment. No, you are under protection. There is a distinction. There is, she agreed. How long? Until I understand the scope of what we are dealing with. He returned to his food. Marin will continue his research. You will continue yours. I will continue mine. We will share information as it develops. She looked at the table for a moment. Outside, she could hear the keep's evening sounds, the change of the guard, the distant clang of the kitchen closing for the night. You have read the old texts, she said, about the silver-blooded. The ones my archive holds, yes. Then you know what Marin told me, about what the silver blood historically did for the territories around it. Calum looked at her steadily. Yes. Does that factor into your calculation, about what I am worth to you? There was a pause that was neither short nor long, but simply precisely as long as it needed to be. Everything factors into every calculation, he said. That is what calculation means. It was, she thought, the most honest answer a person in his position could give. She was not sure whether it was reassuring or not. She decided that it did not need to be either. It needed to be true, and it was. She finished her meal. She thanked him, which he received with a brief nod. She returned to the archive. By midnight she had found 3 more texts referencing the Silver Line. By dawn she had filled 6 pages of notes in her small, careful handwriting and had begun to understand something about herself that no one in Ashvale had ever given her the tools to consider. She was not a broken wolf. She was not less than a wolf. She was the thing wolves had come from, and somewhere in that knowledge was something that felt, for the first time in her life, like the ground holding steady beneath her feet. 3 weeks into her stay at the Iron Keep, Sarah made a discovery that had nothing to do with any book. She was in the small inner training yard at the side of the main hall, the one used by the King's Guard for early morning drills, except that at this particular hour, the hour just after the night guard changed, and before the day had properly committed to itself, it was empty. She had started coming here because it was quiet and had stone benches along the wall where she could sit and think, and because thinking indoors had started to feel like it was narrowing her, all that stone and lamp oil air. She was sitting on the bench with her notes in her lap when she heard footsteps on the flagstones and looked up. Calum was crossing the yard in a dark practice shirt with his sleeves rolled back, carrying 2 short wooden practice rods. He stopped when he saw her. He had clearly expected the yard to be empty. There was a moment where both of them made a rapid, wordless assessment of the situation. Then he set one of the rods on the stone beside him and continued across the yard to the center post, which was a thick wooden column set in the ground for exactly the kind of practice he was apparently about to do. He did not ask her to leave. She did not offer to go. She watched him for a while, not intrusively, with the same quality of attention she gave most things. He was good. She had expected that, but the reality of watching it was different from the expectation. He moved with a precise economy that was clearly the product of years of practice rather than natural ease, the kind of skill that had been earned incrementally and maintained at some consistent cost of time and effort. Each strike was placed exactly. No energy went anywhere that was not specifically sent. "What are you training for?" she asked, after a while. He did not stop or look at her. What does anyone train for? Some people train to maintain skill. Some train because they expect to need it soon. A pause. Your form is not maintenance. You are accelerating something. He did stop then. He turned toward her with the practice rod in his hand, and that familiar recalibrating expression. What makes you say that? The weight of the strikes. Maintenance is lighter. You are building toward a specific load. She looked at the post. What are you building toward? He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the bench on the opposite wall and picked up a cloth to wipe his hands. The Ironjaw Syndicate's lead alpha has sent a formal declaration to my council. He is calling it a territorial complaint, which is the legal mechanism available to him under pack law. It will require a formal hearing within 60 days. And at the hearing? At the hearing, If I cannot disprove his territorial claims with sufficient force, the council must consider mediation. And mediation means compromise, and compromise, in this case, means the syndicate gains legitimate standing in the Northern Territories. He wiped his hands with complete attention, which is not going to happen. So you are preparing for a fight that the hearing will either produce or prevent. Yes. She looked at the practice post. Could I try? He looked at her. You have never trained. I have carried heavy things in difficult conditions for 5 years. I am not without strength. A pause. And I have something that needs working out. He looked at her for a moment with a particular quality she was starting to recognize, the look of a man who was making a decision that surprised him slightly. He crossed the yard and handed her the second practice rod. She turned it in her hands, feeling the weight and the balance, the place where it naturally wanted to sit. Strike the post, he said, however you like. She struck it, too high, too much shoulder, not enough follow-through. The rod bounced back awkwardly, and she had to step to keep her footing. Again, he said, no inflection. She struck again. Better. He did not offer instruction immediately. He watched her work through it herself for a few repetitions, and she noticed that he watched the way she received each failure, the way she adjusted, the specific sequence of her adjustments. He was not simply watching the strikes. He was watching how she learned. Lower your shoulder, he said, after the 6th attempt. She lowered it. The 7th strike landed clean, the rod driving into the post with a satisfying solidity and returning in a controlled arc. She felt the difference immediately. Yes, he said, simply that. She worked through 15 more repetitions. He corrected her 3 more times, each correction precise and minimal, 1 word or 2 at most. She noticed that he did not say well done or good or any of the encouraging commentary that instructors sometimes offered because they were managing someone's feelings. He simply corrected what needed correcting and acknowledged what was working. It was, she thought, the way she preferred to be taught. They did not talk during this, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people doing work. When she set the rod down on the bench, her arm aching pleasantly and her breathing elevated, she found that the thing she had said she needed to work out had, in fact, shifted somewhat. The weight of the previous weeks, the discoveries in the archive, the implications of what Marin was finding, the knowledge that people had been searching for her line with violent intentions, had been sitting in her body like a stone she had been carrying without putting down. The physical work had not removed it, but it had moved it to a more manageable location. Same time tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. If I am here, he said, which was not a yes, but was not a no. She nodded and collected her notes and left the yard. He was there the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the 2nd week of these early sessions, they had developed a loose routine. She arrived before him, usually. He arrived and they worked without preamble. He corrected her when correction was needed. She asked questions about technique when she had them. He answered directly. She noticed that the sessions had started running longer, not by any stated decision, simply by the addition of more repetitions, more variations, more ground covered. She also noticed that he talked more during these sessions than he did in any other context she had observed him in. Not personal things, not emotional things, but he talked about what he was teaching her with a directness and detail that he did not apply to most of his dealings with the people around him. One morning, while they were taking a break at opposite ends of the yard, he said, without any particular preamble, "You spent 5 years being told you were without value." She was looking at her hands, the silver faintly visible beneath the skin, in the way it sometimes was when she was physically active. She looked up at him. "Yes. And you chose to learn anyway, to read, to become useful. I chose to become necessary," she said. "There is a difference. Useful can be discarded when the use is done. Necessary is harder to remove." He looked at her with that recalibrating expression for a moment. That is a calculation that required a certain kind of mind to arrive at. It required a certain kind of situation, she said. The mind came after. He was quiet for a moment. "My wolf has been silent for 3 years, he said. This was so unlike his usual mode of speech that it stopped the air between them. He appeared, briefly, to notice that he had said it. He looked away. "I mention it because it is relevant to something Marin's research is raising. Not for any other reason." She kept her voice level. What does Marin's research say about it? That the silver blood has a historical association with wolfsbanes, with their strength and their stability. He was looking at the far wall. His theory is that the proximity of a silver blood to a wolf with a damaged or dormant bond can act as a kind of restoration, the way a tuning fork can cause another instrument to vibrate in the same note simply by being near it. She considered this carefully. And your wolf has been doing something other than being silent since I arrived. A pause. Yes. She looked at the practice rod in her hands. That must be disconcerting. It is unexpected, he said, which was not quite the same thing, and she thought the distinction was deliberate. I am not doing it on purpose, she said. I know that. Another pause. I am not suggesting it is a problem. I am sharing information that seems relevant, because you said you preferred direct communication. She looked at him. He was still looking at the wall. There was something in his jaw, a tightness, that spoke of a person who had said more than they had planned to, and were now sitting with the consequences of that. She had spent 5 years being dismissed by people who had power over her life. She had learned, from that, to be very careful about the difference between a person's manner and their intention, because the two were frequently not the same thing. Caleb's manner was cold. She had known that from the first moment in the Ashvale courtyard. But his intention, as far as she had been able to observe it across 3 weeks of close proximity, was something else. He ran a fortress of several hundred people, and she had not yet seen him treat one of them with cruelty that was not immediately necessary to prevent a larger harm. He was sharp. He was demanding. He did not perform kindness. But he did not perform cruelty either. Thank you for telling me, she said. He looked at her then, brief and direct. You are different from what I expected. What did you expect? What? He thought about this with the actual seriousness that he brought to most questions, rather than the social deflection she had grown to expect from people in power. I expected someone who had spent 5 years in the position you occupied to be smaller, in the way that people become small when they have been told long enough that they are small. She was quiet for a moment. I had Berta, she said, and Gil, and books. 3 things is enough, if they are the right 3 things. He looked at her for a moment, and then he picked up his practice rod and returned to the post, and she stood and picked up hers, and they returned to work without further comment. But that evening, when Harlow brought the evening meal to the working room, and she sat across the table from the Alpha King again, she noticed something. He had moved her chair approximately 8 inches closer to his side of the table. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could be attributed to Harlow rearranging the room for cleaning purposes. But Harlow was a man of absolute precision in these arrangements, and the distance had been exactly correct before. She sat down in the chair where it was and said nothing. He did not mention it either. They ate in the particular kind of silence that had started, across these weeks, to feel less like the absence of conversation, and more like a mode of it. Marin appeared at the end of the meal, with a new volume under his arm, and his wire lenses pushed up onto his forehead, and the expression of a man who had found something significant enough that it could not wait for morning. Caleb looked up from his remaining water. Sit down, Marin, he said. Marin sat. He set the book on the table between them, and opened it with the deliberate care of someone handling something fragile. The page it opened to held a list of names in that old pre-common tongue dialect, and beside each name, a date, and beside each date, a notation that took Sarah a moment to decode. She decoded it. She looked up at Marin. These are all silver-blooded individuals from the historical record, she said. Yes, Marin said. His voice was quieter than usual. And the notation beside each name is the manner of their removal from the historical record. She looked at the list again. The notations were all the same word, different only in their dialect spelling across the span of years the list covered. The word meant eliminated. How many are on this list? She asked. In this volume, 47 names, Marin said. I believe there are 2 further volumes that continue it. They are in a section of the archive I have not yet fully catalogued. She looked at the list. 47 names. People who had been found and removed, over the course of centuries, for carrying what she carried. People who might have been her ancestors, who had certainly been someone's children, someone's family, someone's Berta or Gil or candle in a woodshed. Caleb was looking at the list with an expression that she could not catalogue, but it was not nothing. It was the expression of a man who was confronting something that had implications wider than the immediate practical problem, and who was allowing himself, briefly, to let that register. She reached across the table and turned the book slightly, reading more carefully down the list of names. She stopped at one. Cavell, Nora Cavell. The name was there, with a date that was not old, a date that was in fact 4 years ago. Her mother. The notation beside it was different from the others, not the word for eliminated. A different notation, one she had to ask Marin to translate. He looked at the word for a moment, and something in his expression became careful. It means unconfirmed, he said. She sat with that for a long time. Unconfirmed. Her mother had been found, had been targeted, and the people doing the finding had not been certain, in the end, of what had happened to her. Which meant, possibly, that they were still looking. Which meant, almost certainly, that they would look here next. She looked across the table at Calum, who had reached the same conclusion. She could see it, at approximately the same moment. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Not as long as I would like," he said. The morning after Marin showed them the list, Sarah did not go to the archive. She went to the stables instead, because she needed to think in a way that books could not help with, and physical work had always been the clearest channel between what she was feeling and what she was able to understand about what she was feeling. She arrived before the stable hands, before the horses had been given their morning hay, and she moved down the row of stalls doing it herself, pulling flakes from the bales stacked at the end of the corridor, setting each one into each hay net without any agenda except the completion of the task. The horses accepted her, as animals always had. They pressed their large soft heads toward her as she passed, and she rested her hand on each face briefly, not seeking comfort exactly, but not refusing it either. Her mother was alive, possibly. The word unconfirmed sat in her chest like a coal, throwing heat in two directions at once, the direction of hope and the direction of warning, and she did not yet know how to manage the temperature of either one. She had been 12 when her mother left. She remembered the morning clearly, with the specific sharpness that certain memories carry, the detail that indicates the brain registered something important, even before the conscious mind had caught up. Her mother had been quieter than usual at breakfast. She had brushed Sarah's hair with unusual care, and held her face in both hands for a long moment, looking at her. And she had said something that Sarah had not understood then, but had carried in the back of her mind for 9 years like a stone in a pocket, heavy and smooth from turning. She had said, "Whatever they tell you about yourself, you know what you are before the telling." At 12, Sarah had taken it as the kind of thing adults said when they were sad. Some adults spoke in compressed shapes when they were sad, offering something that would make sense later if not immediately. She had filed it away, and spent years not knowing what to file it under. Now she knew. Her mother had known what Sarah carried, had tried to prepare her without exposing her, and had then run, presumably because the thing she was running from had gotten close enough that staying would have led it directly to a 12-year-old girl with silver blood, and no way yet to protect herself. That interpretation, examined from all angles, was painful, in a way that was also, in some essential sense, a relief. Her mother had not left because Sarah was insufficient. She had left because Sarah was too important to risk. These were different things. It mattered that they were different things. She was deep in these thoughts, leaning against the last stall door with a curry brush in her hand and a horse's nose against her shoulder, when she heard Marin's distinctive footstep in the stable corridor. She recognized it by now, the particular slight drag of his left heel, a habit he had developed from decades of walking with his attention in a book rather than on his feet. He appeared at the end of the corridor with his lamp and his satchel, and the urgent expression that had become, over the past weeks, his default setting. "I found them," he said. She turned from the horse. "The other volumes?" "Yes. And I also found something else." He was already pulling the satchel open. "There is a 4th volume in the series that I was not aware existed. It was misfiled in the territorial dispute section, which is why I had not reached it. It is the most recent of the 4, and it contains the clearest account of silver blood capabilities that I have found anywhere in the archive." She took the volume he was extending toward her and looked at the cover. It was newer than the others, the binding still firm, the pages not yet as fragile as the centuries-old texts she had been working with. Newer was a relative term, perhaps 150 years rather than 300. She opened it. The handwriting inside was different from the careful formal script of the other texts. This was personal handwriting, compressed and angular, the writing of someone working quickly, not a formal record, a personal account. She read the opening paragraph and understood immediately what she was holding. It was the journal of a silver-blooded woman, the last one, according to the dates, before Sarah herself. A woman named Ellen, no family name given, who had lived in the Northern Territories at a time when the Iron Jaw ancestors were first consolidating power. Ellen had written in a private cipher, and the translator's note at the inside front cover, in Marin's small handwriting, told her that the cipher had taken him most of the night to decode. Sarah sat down on a hay bale and read. Ellen had understood her own nature fully, which meant she had had access to knowledge that Sarah was only now beginning to assemble. She wrote about the silver blood, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had grown up knowing what it was. She described the light that came from her hands. She described the way it worked differently depending on what she brought to it, what she intended, what she was feeling in the moment of release. She described the way bonds responded to her presence, wolf bonds, that had been broken by trauma or grief, drawing toward her the way a compass needle draws to north, not because she pulled them, but because she was the direction they needed. And she described what the silver blood could do to dark bonds, to bonds that had been made through force or harm or deception, the kinds of bonds the syndicate was apparently building through methods that were never going to appear in a council report. Ellen's silver light could dissolve them, not just disrupt them. Dissolve them entirely, returning the individuals held in them to themselves. Sarah read this section 3 times. She emerged from the stable 2 hours later, with the journal under her arm, and went directly to the archive, where Marin was already at work on the second new volume. He looked up when she entered. "The binding capability," she said, without sitting down. "Ellen describes it in the 4th volume, the dissolution of forced bonds." "Yes," he set down his pen. "I read that section several times last night. The syndicate is using forced bonds to hold their wolf members in loyalty. That is how they have grown so quickly and maintain such control. People do not stay because they choose to. They stay because they cannot leave." She set the journal on the table. "That is what this is about. They do not want my blood as a weapon. They want to stop my blood from reaching anyone who is already bound to them, because if I got close enough, their entire hold would dissolve." Marin looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "That is the conclusion I reached at approximately 4 in the morning. Have you told Calum?" "I was waiting for you," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. It was a small thing, but it was not a small thing. He had found something that directly concerned her, and had waited so that she could be in the room when it was presented. He had treated her as a principal in this, rather than a subject of it. "Thank you," she said. He waved his hand dismissively, which meant he had heard her. They went together to the working room. Calum was already there, at his desk, with Harlow standing at the map wall pointing to something in the northern section of the territorial chart. They both turned when the door opened. She told him what she had found. She told him clearly, and in the correct order, starting with Ellen's journal and its description of capabilities, moving to the dissolution of forced bonds, and arriving at the logical conclusion about the syndicate's motive. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported. She laid it out the way she would lay firewood, piece by piece, each one bearing the weight of the next. He listened without interrupting. Harlow listened with his arms crossed, and his expression moving in small increments that she had learned to read as his version of significant response. When she finished, there was a pause. "How far does the dissolution range?" Calum asked. She looked at Marin, who answered, "Ellen's accounts suggest close proximity, within a significant distance, but not at range. The individual holding the forced bond would need to be physically near, so she would need to be near the syndicate's bound members to release them." "Yes." Calum turned to the map. He studied it for a moment. She watched the way he thought, the particular quality of his attention when he was working through a strategic problem, the way his focus gathered and then opened again as he took in a wider view. "The hearing is in 53 days, he said. "The syndicate will be required to send representatives to the council seat, bound members." He turned from the map. "They will bring their strongest wolves, the ones most thoroughly held." He looked at Sarah. "What happens to a forced bond when it is dissolved in a legal setting?" She looked at Marin. "The released individual would be free to testify to the conditions of their captivity," Marin said quietly, "in council, on the record." The room was very still. That is a different kind of battle than the one I was preparing for, Calum said. It is a better one, Sarah said. He looked at her. Not the recalibrating expression this time. Something that she could not name with the same precision. Something that was less processed and more immediate. Yes, he said. It is. Harlow cleared his throat. There is the small matter of keeping her alive until the hearing, he said. His voice was dry, but his eyes were not. I am aware, Calum said. The syndicate will move before the hearing, if they understand what she can do, Sarah said. They will not wait for a legal process they know will destroy them. Also aware, he said. He looked at Harlow. Double the perimeter shifts. No external communication without my direct review. He looked at Sarah. Your sessions in the training yard will include 2 of my guard from now on. Not as watchers, as combatants. You need to understand how to work alongside trained wolves. She noted that he had said you need to understand, not I need to be sure you are protected. The distinction was small and significant. All right, she said. And I need to know what you can actually do. He said it the way he said most things, plainly. Not what the texts say you can do, not what Ellen's journal describes. What you, specifically, can produce and control. She met his gaze. So do I, she said honestly. He looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved, barely, in the direction of something that was not quite an expression, but was heading toward one. Good, he said. That is where we start. The practice sessions in the training yard changed after that. They were longer, more structured, and considerably more demanding than anything Sarah had experienced before. 2 of Calum's senior guards, a woman named Petra, and a quiet, precise man named Cole, joined them each morning. They were both experienced shifters, trained in close-range combat, and they worked alongside her not as opponents but as partners, learning her range and her limits as she learned theirs. The silver light came more reliably now than it had in Ashvale. She was beginning to understand that it responded to intentionality. Panic produced it, as it had in the courtyard, but panic produced it poorly, in an uncontrolled burst that spent itself fast. Intention produced it differently, steadier, more directional. She was not there yet, not even close to the control that Ellen had described in the journal, but she was finding the edges of the capability, and finding the edges was always the first useful step. Calum trained alongside her during these sessions, as he had before, but not separately now. He trained with Petra and Cole, and occasionally with Sarah, and she noticed something in those moments when they were directly paired. He was careful with her, not in the way of someone managing a fragile person, but in the way of someone managing an unknown quantity with respect. He did not underestimate her. He did not overestimate her. He adjusted. On the 15th day after the list had been found, they were working in the yard in the gray early morning, when Harlow appeared at the gate with an expression that overrode the usual training-in-progress understanding. He had a sealed letter. He crossed to Calum and handed it over without a word. Calum broke the seal and read it standing, without moving to a seat or turning away for privacy. When he finished, he lowered the letter and looked at Sarah. The syndicate has sent a second communication, he said. They have formally requested, through council channels, the extradition of an unnamed female from the Iron Keep. They have listed her as a person of strategic interest under Article 9 of the Territorial Compact. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Article 9 covers individuals in possession of capabilities that affect territorial stability, she said. She had read the Pack Law volume twice. Yes, he said. So they have made it legal. They have made it a formal request, which is not quite the same as making it legal. He looked at the letter again. I will respond through council as well, formally. A pause. You cannot be extradited without your consent, and without proof that the requesting party has a valid territorial claim over you. Which they will try to manufacture, she said. Yes. How long does the formal response process take? 14 days minimum. More if I use every procedural option available. She did the calculation. 53 days to the hearing, minus 14 days of procedure, minus whatever the syndicate would attempt in the window between. She was not a mathematician, but the arithmetic of danger was something she understood well, from a long education in working with what was available. Then we had better make the next 14 days count, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had been seeing more frequently, one that was not yet familiar to her, but was becoming so. the expression of a man who kept arriving at the same place, from a direction he had not expected. "Yes," he said, and turned back to the practice yard. The first attempt came on the 9th night. Sarah was in the archive, working by lamplight, when the sound of the keep going from its nighttime quiet into something faster reached her even underground. She had been in the Iron Keep long enough to know its sounds the way she had known Ashvale's sounds, the particular vocabulary of a place lived in, and what she heard above her head was not the routine of a fortress at night. It was the sound of people moving fast and not telling each other why. She closed the book she had been reading and stood. The corridor outside the archive was empty, which meant the people moving fast were moving somewhere specific, not spreading generally through the keep. She went upstairs and came out into the main hall's ground level, where two of the regular night guard were crossing at speed toward the eastern exterior. One of them, a young man named Bray, whose face she had learned over weeks of sharing the same space, stopped when he saw her. "Stay inside," he said, not unkindly, with the specific urgency of a person who did not have time to explain, but did not want to leave her uninformed. "What is it?" she asked. "Someone at the eastern wall. Harlow has eyes on it." He was already moving again. "Stay inside, please." She stayed inside, but she went to the nearest interior window that gave a view of the eastern section, and she stood there and watched the torches moving along the wall top in the patterns of active response, rather than routine patrol. It lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then the pattern slowed. The torches returned to their regular positions. 3 minutes later, Harlow appeared in the interior corridor, moving toward Calum's working room on the upper level. She was in the corridor when he reached it. He looked at her without surprise. "It was a probe," he said, "not a true incursion attempt. 2 individuals at the wall, equipped for climbing. They withdrew the moment the watch responded." He paused. "They were not trying to get in. They were testing our response time." The implications of that were not complicated. "How fast did the watch respond?" she asked. 42 seconds. "And now they know that?" "Yes." His expression was flat, but his eyes were working. "It is information collection. They want to know what they are dealing with before they commit to an actual attempt." She looked at the ceiling, towards Calum's floor above them. "Is he awake?" "He has been awake for the past 3 hours. A pause. "He rarely sleeps more than 4 hours, you may have noticed." She had noticed. She had also noticed that he worked through most of those hours in a consistent state of controlled activity, never frantic, never idle, always with some specific purpose in front of him. She had wondered, at various points, what it cost him to maintain that level of sustained attention, and whether there was anyone in the keep who noticed the cost the way she noticed it. She suspected there was not. "Tell him I would like to speak with him," she said. Harlow looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man assessing a request for its strategic value. He appeared to find it acceptable. He went upstairs. She was shown up 2 minutes later. The working room at this hour had a different quality than it did in daylight. The fire was lower, the documents on the desk fewer and more selected, the light warmer and more concentrated. Calum was standing at the window when she entered, looking at the eastern wall where the torches were returning to normal. He had clearly been awake for some time, and looked it, not disheveled, he would never be disheveled, but stripped of the formal layer that daylight interactions always carried. Just a man standing at a window at night, with a cup of something in his hand. She stood at the center of the room and waited for him to turn. He did, and looked at her, with the specific expression of a person who is slightly more accessible than they intend to be, which he apparently recognized in himself, because he set down the cup and straightened. "They are mapping our defense," she said. "Yes." "How long before the next attempt?" 3 days, perhaps 4. They will analyze what they learned tonight, and make adjustments, and then test again. He crossed to his desk and looked at the document lying open on it. "The pattern with the syndicate has been consistent. Gather information, plan specifically, execute precisely." A pause. "They do not waste resources on improvisation." "Which makes them predictable," she said. He looked at her. "Does it?" "In a specific way. Improvisation is hard to read because it has no shape. A precise plan has a shape. Once you understand the shape of how they think, you can predict the form of what they intend." She moved to the window he had been standing at and looked at the wall. The torches were steady now, normal. "They will probe for your weakest point, the point where your response was slowest, or where the coverage was thinnest. If I were them, that would be the north side. The wall there is older. The walkway is narrower. He came to stand beside her, not close, but beside her, looking at the same wall. I know about the north wall, he said. I know you know, she said. I am saying they will find out too, and within 4 days they will have it. A pause. Unless the north wall is not actually your weakest point. He looked at her. Unless the weakest point tonight was deliberate, she said. Something shifted in his expression. She had learned to track these small shifts. This one was the look he got when someone said something that aligned with something he had already been thinking but had not yet committed to. You want to set something up, he said. I want to give them the shape they are looking for, but put the filling in myself. She looked at the wall. Let them think the north side is what they need. Reinforce the east, obviously, to confirm the north as the comparative gap. And then when they come in through the north. Petra and Cole are already there, he said. And I am there, she said. Silence. He looked at her profile, rather than the wall. She could feel the quality of the look, the particular attention of a person working through objections in real time. You are not trained for that scenario, he said. I am trained for close-range work with Petra and Cole, which is exactly what that scenario requires. She turned to look at him directly. The texts say the silver light is most effective in close proximity to a forced bond. The syndicate's operatives are almost certainly bound to their alpha. If I am there when they breach, the same thing that happened in Ashvale happens here, except controlled. Except the last time it happened, you were running on panic and had no control over it, he said. 15 days of training ago, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire shifted, and the light in the room moved with it. You are asking me to use you as bait, he said. I am asking you to let me be a functional part of the defense, rather than the thing being defended. A pause. I understand the distinction matters to you strategically. I am telling you it matters to me as well, for different reasons. He looked away. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the fire settling in the grate, and the distant sound of wind moving across the keep's upper walls. We will run it once as a training scenario first, he said. Tomorrow, before dawn. If Petra and Cole think the positioning is workable, we proceed. She turned back to the window. All right. He did not move away. She was aware of him standing beside her in the same quality of proximity they had been sharing for weeks now, the particular nearness of two people who have spent enough time in the same space to have stopped performing comfort or discomfort. Your mother is alive, he said. She had not expected him to say that. She turned to look at him. Marin confirmed it this afternoon, he said. I did not tell you immediately, because I wanted the confirmation to be solid before I said anything. He met her gaze. He found a secondary record in the same volume where her name appears. A notation added by the same person who maintained the list, not in the cipher, in plain text. A question, essentially. Whether the subject had been fully accounted for. The notation had never been answered. She was quiet. We do not know where she is, he said, or what condition she is in. But the absence of a confirmed notation in a record that has been maintained carefully for 2 centuries is not nothing. No, she said, it is not nothing. He did not offer her anything further than the information, which was correct. Some things did not need accompaniment. She was grateful for the correctness of it. She stood at the window for another minute, then turned to go. Sarah, he said. She stopped. He was looking at the wall again, not at her. The wolf that woke up when I arrived at Ashvale, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that in the flatness of his voice, the specific flatness of a person who has decided to pay a cost because the alternative costs more. It has not gone quiet again. She stood at the door without turning around. I know, she said. She left. In the corridor below, she pressed her hands against the cold stone wall and looked at them. The silver was faintly visible in the dark, luminous, in the way it had been doing more and more frequently when her emotions were elevated. Not panic, not fear. Something else, something she did not have a precise word for, which was unusual for her. She was a person who generally had words. She went back to the archive and sat with it for a while. The books did not have anything to say about this particular situation. She did not ask them to. She simply sat in the cold stone room, with her hands in her lap, and the faint silver light coming off her skin, and she let herself feel what she was feeling, without immediately converting it into a problem to be solved. In the morning, before dawn, they ran the training scenario. Petra took the position she had been given. Cole took the second. Sarah stood at the center of the north wall section, where the wall met the corner of an old storage building, providing a natural blind. The exercise was designed for her to work in low light with 2 trained wolves who would be in shifted form, which meant she needed to read their movements by sound and shadow as much as by sight. Harlow played the incursion. He was careful and systematic about it, coming in exactly as an experienced operative would, using the wall's old stonework for handholds, timing the movement to the gap between patrol passes. He was very good. He was nearly at the top of the wall when Sarah felt it, the same sensation that had moved through her in Ashvale when Calum arrived, but different now, reversed. Not her own power responding to an external presence. The pressure of a forced bond, hitting her silver sense, the way a wrong note hits a trained ear. He crossed the wall top and dropped to the inside, and she was already turning with both hands raised, and the light came out clean and directed, the way it had been doing in training, finding the specific resonance of what she was targeting, and going there precisely. Harlow stopped, not because the light struck him with the same force it had hit the rogue creature in Ashvale. He stopped because the forced bond he was simulating, an old pack bond that had been ceremonially applied for training purposes in exactly this scenario, dissolved completely. He stood in the compound yard and looked at his hands for a moment, with an expression of pure, unperformed surprise. He turned to look at her. "It did not hurt," he said. His voice was different, lighter, by a fraction. "No," Sarah said, "it would not." Petra and Cole, in their wolf forms at the edges of the yard, were still. Then, slowly, they both moved towards Sarah with the same quiet, low-headed movement that the dogs in Ashvale had always shown her. Recognition. The language of the original. Harlow looked at them, then at Sarah. He was a man of very compressed expression, but what was on his face now was not compressed. It was open. "Tell the Alpha King," he said, "that the plan will work." The second probe came on the third night, exactly as Calum had predicted. It came at the north wall, exactly as Sarah had predicted. 2 operatives this time, moving with the specific competence of people who had done this kind of work many times and had good information. They had identified the north wall on the first probe, confirmed it was the thinnest point in the active defense, and planned accordingly. They came in during the shift change, in the window between one patrol moving off and the next not yet reaching full position. The window was 6 minutes. They had timed it to the second. What they had not accounted for was Sarah standing in the shadow of the storage building, entirely still, with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing level, and 2 of the best wolves the Iron Keep trained standing 20 feet to her left and right in their shifted forms, completely invisible in the dark. She felt the first operative the moment he reached the wall top. The forced bond came in, like a sound she could hear with something other than her ears, a pressure against her silver sense that was tight and wrong, and clearly imposed rather than chosen. She did not react yet. She let him drop to the inside of the wall, let him move 3 steps toward the compound center. She let the second one come over the wall. Then she raised both hands and let the light go. It was clean. It was directed. It found each bond with the precision she had been building for weeks, and it dissolved them the way the morning dissolves dark, not with force, but with a completeness that left nothing behind. Not because they were struck down, because something that had been pressing against them from the inside, something so constant that they had stopped feeling it as external pressure and had started experiencing it as just the texture of their own existence, was suddenly gone. One of them, a lean man with gray in his hair and a face that had clearly carried a long time of something heavy, sat down on the ground. Just sat, not collapsed, sat deliberately, the way a person sits when their legs have done their job and the rest of them needs a moment. The other, a younger woman, put both hands to her face. She stood there with her hands over her face and made no sound, but her shoulders moved. Petra and Cole moved in from the sides, not threateningly, but with the enclosed movement of trained wolves who were securing a perimeter, not attacking. Harlow appeared from the east doorway, where he had been positioned, and crossed the yard at a controlled pace. The man on the ground looked up when Harlow reached him. He looked at Sarah. In the faint light coming from the wall torches, his expression was not what she had expected. Not defiance, Not calculation. The particular look of a person who has just arrived somewhere they had forgotten they were trying to reach. I have not made a decision without his voice in my head for 11 years, he said. His voice was rough. Do you know what that is like? It was not a question. No, she said, but I imagine you do. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Harlow. We were not here to harm anyone. We were sent to find out if she is what they think she is. And? Harlow said. The man looked at Sarah. She is. She crossed to where he was still sitting. She crouched down to his level, which put her face at the same height as his. This was a choice she had made without deliberating on it, the instinct of someone who had spent years at the bottom of a hierarchy and knew what it felt like to have people talk at you from above. Your alpha sent you here, she said. Yes. Do you want to go back to him? The man was quiet for a moment. The question sat between them like an object. Not particularly, he said. She stood. She looked at Harlow. Can they be held safely? She asked. Not as a prisoner request. As a practical question. Yes, he said. Comfortably? He looked at her with an expression that contained something she could not fully categorize, but that Petra, coming to stand near her shoulder, caught and looked away from, with a carefully neutral face. Yes, he said. Comfortably. She looked at the young woman, who had lowered her hands, and was standing quietly, with the look of someone who had been running a very long time, and had just been told the running could stop. She was perhaps 20, which was younger than Sarah had expected. Your name, Sarah said, not commanded. Asked. Dara, the young woman said. Dara, do you need anything right now? Water? Something to eat? Dara looked at her with the particular expression of someone to whom this kind of question had not been directed in so long that they could not immediately process it as genuine. She looked at the man on the ground. He gave a small nod. Water, Dara said. Please. Nell was summoned. Water was brought. The two operatives were taken to comfortable rooms in the secondary building, with no locks on the doors but with Petra and Cole nearby, which communicated restraint without cruelty. Sarah went upstairs to find Caleb. He was in the upper corridor, which meant he had been watching the courtyard from the window above. He had seen it. She came up the stairs and found him standing at the window still, turned slightly toward her as she arrived on the landing. In the low light of the corridor lamp, his face had that accessible quality it occasionally had late at night, when he had been awake too long, and the formal layer had worn thinner than he probably intended. They were not sent to harm you, he said. No, they were sent to confirm what I am. She came to stand beside him at the window, looking down at the now empty yard. They confirmed it, and then sat down on the ground, he said. One of them did. A pause. He had been held under a forced bond for 11 years. Caleb was quiet. She could feel the quality of his silence. It had different textures, she had learned. This one was the texture of a person receiving information that they were allowing to land, rather than immediately converting to strategy. The woman is perhaps 20, she said. Dara, she cried. He did not say anything. The syndicate is not a coordinated willing army, she said. It is a collection of people being held, which means when those bonds dissolve at the hearing, the scale of what walks free is not going to be two people sitting in a courtyard. It is going to be, she stopped. Significant, he said. Yes. He turned from the window and looked at her. The corridor lamp threw the light across his face from the left, and she could see the line of his jaw and the specific quality of his eyes when he was looking at something he had decided mattered. She had catalogued a great many of his expressions by now. Carefully, the way she catalogued everything, but this one remained the hardest to interpret with complete precision. You are not afraid of this, he said, of what you are and what it requires. She looked at him steadily. I have had 5 years of practice at not being afraid of what I am, she said. The situations change. The practice is the same. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved further than it usually did before he caught it. He turned away, back toward his working room. Get some sleep, he said. We have 31 days. She almost moved toward her room. She stopped. Caleb, she said. She had not used his name before, and both of them registered it. He stopped walking, though he did not immediately turn. Your wolf, she said. The way it has been responding since I arrived. She was careful with her words because she was being careful with his. I want you to know that it does not complicate anything for me. Whatever it is, whatever it means, it does not change how I am able to work with you. He was still. Then he turned, slowly. Is that what you are concerned about? He said. That it might complicate our working arrangement. She looked at him. What else would I be concerned about? He held her gaze for a moment that lasted its own specific duration, long enough to make her aware of the silence in the corridor and the distance between them, which was not large. Nothing, he said. He turned again. Get some sleep. She went to her room. She lay on her back in the dark for a long time, with her hands folded on her chest and the silver faintly visible at her fingertips, and she thought about the man named Calum Voss, and the fact that the most powerful person she had ever encountered was, under considerable layers of cold efficiency, a person who had been badly hurt by something, and had decided that the safest thing to do with the place the hurt had left was to fill it with work. She recognized the strategy intimately. She had used it herself. The difference between her version and his was primarily one of scale. She did not know exactly what the 3 years of his wolf's silence meant, in the full personal sense. She knew what it implied, from what she had read: a bond trauma, a loss of the person a wolf recognized as its anchor. She had not asked, he had not told her. There were things that did not need asking, because asking would not make the information useful, and all she needed to know was what she already knew, which was that it mattered to him, in a way that was older and deeper than his capacity to be fully strategic about it. And that his wolf had woken up when she arrived. She turned onto her side and looked at the window, where the night was beginning to lighten toward the very earliest edge of gray. She was not, she decided, going to spend the next 31 days pretending she did not know what she was feeling. She was not going to allow herself the luxury of acting on it either, not yet, not with this much at stake and this much still unresolved. But she was not going to pretend. She had been told for 5 years that she was less than what she was. She had learned, in the hardest possible school, that pretending about important things was a very expensive habit. In the morning, she arrived in the training yard before anyone else, and was already working the post, when Calum came through the gate, with his practice rod in hand, and no particular expression on his face. He stopped when he saw her. She did not stop what she was doing. You are late, she said. There was a pause. By 3 minutes, he said. 3 minutes is late. She finished the sequence and turned to look at him. Are you going to stand there or are you going to train? He crossed the yard without further commentary and picked up his position at the post beside her, and they worked side by side in the gray morning light, the way they had been doing for weeks, and the compound sound of 2 practice rods on 2 wooden posts kept time in the quiet yard. And somewhere above them a bird was beginning its morning work, and Sarah thought that this, specifically this, the work and the morning, and the person beside her who was choosing, slowly and in his own time, to let something matter, was the best thing she had felt in a very long time. She did not say any of this. She did not need to. On the 18th day after the second probe, a message arrived via the formal council courier. The syndicate's lead alpha, a man whose name was on no public record, but whose signature appeared on the council correspondence, had responded to Calum's formal legal reply with a counter-communication. He had amended his extradition request. He was no longer requesting Sarah be handed over. He was requesting, in the careful language of pack law, that she be brought to the council hearing as a witness, a voluntary witness, under the terms of the neutral ground provision that applied to all council sessions. Which meant in practice that she would walk into the hearing room and stand within range of every forced bond the syndicate's alpha had built over 11 years. Calum set the letter down and looked at her across the working room table. He thinks he is setting a trap, she said. Yes, Calum said. She looked at the letter. He has accidentally designed the exact scenario we needed. There was a pause. Yes, Calum said again, and this time the word sounded different. Lighter. The way a word sounds when the balance that has been building for weeks tips finally toward the side you needed it on. The council seat was a 3-day ride from the Iron Keep, and they left before dawn, on a morning when the sky was the particular dark blue that precedes light by about an hour, the color of something enormous holding its breath. The full complement of Calum's traveling guard rode with them, 12 wolves, plus Harlow at his usual left shoulder position, and behind the main formation, in a covered carriage that was for the benefit of any watching eyes, rather than for Sarah's comfort, the two former syndicate operatives, Dara, and the older man whose name was Fen. Both had agreed to appear at the hearing as witnesses. The decision had been theirs. Nobody had asked it of them. Dara had volunteered first, quietly, 2 mornings after the courtyard encounter, appearing at Marin's archive door and saying in a flat, precise voice that she was willing to speak to whatever counsel needed to hear from her. Fen had come to find Calum directly and made his offer in the working room while Sarah was present, looking at the Alpha King across the table with the eyes of a man who had been given something back and intended to be serious about what he did with it. Calum had accepted without ceremony. He had simply thanked them and asked Harlow to begin the preparations for 2 additional travelers. Sarah rode beside the carriage for the first stretch of the journey, talking to Dara through the small window. Dara was not a talkative person, having spent enough years in circumstances that punished unsolicited speech, but she had questions, specific and careful, about what the hearing would involve, what would be asked of her, what the council's authority meant in terms of her safety afterward. Sarah answered each question directly and fully, and when she did not know the answer, she said so, and said who would know. On the second morning, when they stopped at midday for the horses, she found Calum beside her, without having sought him out, both of them looking at the map that Harlow had spread on a flat stone while they ate. "He will be there himself," Calum said, without specifying who. He did not need to. "I know," she said. "His bond capability is significant. He has been building it for over a decade. The range at which he can apply a forced bond is longer than what I can completely protect against in an open hearing room." She looked at the map. The council seat was marked with a small circle, surrounded by the notation of the neutral ground clause that applied within its walls. "He cannot apply a bond to me directly," she said. "I carry something he cannot overlay." "No," Calum agreed, "but he can use the people around you as a different kind of leverage." She looked at him. He was looking at the map. "He will try to take someone I care about," she said, "to use as a threat against what I am willing to do in the room. It is the tactical response to a capability he cannot counter directly." He still looked at the map. "He has had longer to prepare for this hearing than we have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dara and Fen." "Yes, and Harlow." A pause. "Petra and Cole." She processed this. "Marin," she added. "Marin is not coming to the hearing," Calum said. She looked at him sharply. "He is remaining at the keep," Calum said, "with the archive volumes, because if something goes wrong at the hearing, the documentation of everything those texts contain needs to be somewhere the syndicate cannot reach it. Marin is the only person who can interpret and protect that material in the specific way it needs." He met her eyes. "I made this decision 3 days ago. I did not tell you because I was going to. And then the morning schedule ran ahead of the conversation." It was, she recognized, a thing that required no apology and that he had not offered one for. He had made a tactical decision and was explaining it after the fact. This was the behavior of someone who trusted their own judgment and expected others to engage with that judgment directly if they disagreed. She did not disagree. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You are not concerned that I made a decision that affected you without consulting you first." "I am concerned about whether the decision is correct," she said, "which it appears to be. Being concerned about the process takes time we do not have." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to the map and pointed to the road ahead. "We will arrive at midday tomorrow," he said. "The hearing begins the following morning." She looked at the map. The road ran through open territory for the final stretch, which meant visible, which meant the syndicate's scouts, if any were watching this route, would have most of a day to report back on the composition of Calum's party. "They will see who is with us," she said. "Yes." "They will see that Dara and Fen are alive." "Yes." She looked at him. "That changes their calculation." "I expect it to." His tone was even, but there was something behind it. Not quite satisfaction, but the quality of a person who has been playing a long game and has just watched the board shift as intended. It tells them that we have former members in our party who have been released and are willing to speak. Which means the syndicate's alpha now knows that his primary advantage, the loyalty of his bound wolves, is more fragile than it appeared.
He will try to demonstrate it is not fragile,
she said. Yes. At the hearing. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The horses were being watered nearby, and the sound of it was ordinary and steady against the open sky. What happens if he succeeds? She said. Not from fear, from thoroughness. She needed to know the full shape of the possible outcomes. He considered the question with actual seriousness, which she had come to expect from him, and had come to value considerably. If he demonstrates sufficient territorial standing, and the council cannot disprove his claims, the syndicate receives formal recognition as a council-level entity, which gives them the legal protection to continue what they are doing, but now within a framework that constrains what I can do about it. And me? A pause. The extradition request becomes more formally binding. She looked at the horizon. The sky was clear and cold, and extremely large. Then we should make certain that does not happen, she said. He looked at her from the side. Yes, he said, we should. The council seat was a building that had been doing the same job for 400 years, and looked it. Solid, plain, not old in the way of things that have been neglected, but old in the way of things that have been maintained so well that they have become part of the landscape. It sat at the meeting point of 3 territorial borders, and had been built on that location, specifically because the meeting of borders was the place where law was most necessary and most tested. They arrived at midday. The council staff met them, efficient and neutral in the way that genuinely neutral parties manage, offering neither warmth nor coldness. The hearing rooms were already prepared. The formal guest quarters had been arranged. Sarah was shown to her room. It was plain and adequate, with the same functional lack of ornamentation as everything else in the building. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard below, where the syndicate's delegation had arrived an hour before them and was visible across the far side of the same courtyard. She saw him. She had not known what the syndicate's alpha looked like, had not been able to find a reliable description in anything she had read, but she knew him the moment she saw him, with the same immediate certainty that she had felt the forced bonds of his operatives in the dark compound yard of the Iron Keep. He was not physically remarkable. Medium height, middle-aged, with the kind of contained, deliberate stillness that she recognized. It was the same quality Calum had, the quality of someone who had spent a very long time learning to use power efficiently. The difference was in what it was connected to. She could feel it from the window, the wrong texture of the bonds radiating from him, the way a person can feel the difference between a clean wind and one carrying something unpleasant before they have time to analyze what the unpleasant thing is. He looked up. He did not look at the window specifically. He looked at the building in general, the way a person maps the geography of a place they intend to navigate. But the sweep of his attention passed the window she was standing at, and something in it paused for a fraction of a second. She did not move. He looked away. He turned back to his delegation and said something to the man beside him. She went downstairs to find Calum. The hearing began the following morning in the main council chamber, a high-ceilinged room with stone columns and long windows, and the particular acoustic quality of a space designed so that everyone in it could hear everything said from any position. The council consisted of 7 representatives, one from each of the 7 original founding territories, seated at a long curved table facing the floor of the chamber. Calum sat at the formal respondent's position on the right side of the chamber's floor. The syndicate's alpha, introduced for the record as Varn, sat at the requesting party's position on the left. Sarah sat in the witness gallery behind the council floor, beside Harlow, with Petra and Cole 2 rows back, and Dara and Fen at the far end, at their own request, where they could see the whole room. The opening arguments took most of the first morning. Varn's legal representative, a thin woman, with the precise diction of someone who had argued in this room many times, laid out the syndicate's territorial claims with considerable skill. The claims rested on 3 generations of residence, a body of economic records, and a set of historical pack agreements that, taken in isolation, were not entirely without merit. Calum's response was delivered by himself, without a representative, which made several of the council members adjust in their seats with what Sarah read as involuntary respect. He dismantled the territorial claim in clear, sequential arguments, each one supported by documentation that Harlow produced from a case at his knee, at precisely the right moment. He was neither aggressive nor accommodating. He was precise, and precision in a well-structured argument is more effective than either of those alternatives. It was the afternoon session when everything shifted. Varn had called 3 witnesses from his delegation, all presented as free members of the syndicate, voluntary affiliates with established residency. The first 2 were unremarkable, experienced, steady, clearly prepared. The third was a woman named Cass, and the moment she stepped forward to take the witness position, Sarah felt it. The bond on her was not old. It was recent, tightly applied, and Sarah could read the quality of it the way she could read the quality of a wrong note, not by analysis, but by direct sense. This woman was not here voluntarily. Everything her body was doing was voluntary, her face, her posture, her voice when she began to speak. But the decision that had put her in this room was not hers. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Harlow, without looking at her, placed his hand briefly on her forearm. A question. She turned her head minimally toward him, and then minimally toward the witness. He understood. He leaned toward Calum. 3 words passed between them, too quietly for anyone in the gallery to hear. Calum did not react visibly. He continued looking at the council members with the same flat attention he had maintained all day, but his hand, resting on the table in front of him, moved slightly, 2 fingers dropping in the signal she had learned in the training yard. She rose from her seat. The council chair looked up. The witness for the defense may approach if she has a matter to raise, he said, which was the formal protocol for a witness requesting to speak out of turn. She walked to the floor of the chamber. Varn looked at her for the first time directly, and she felt the thing she had expected, his attention carrying a quality that was his power extended outward, probing. She walked toward the center of the floor, and she kept walking, and the probe hit her silver-like sound hitting a wall, and came back without finding purchase. His eyes changed, briefly, very briefly. She stopped at the center of the floor. She looked at Cass, who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who is performing calm, and doing it well, because they have been doing it for a long time. She did not use her hands. She had not needed her hands in practice for nearly 2 weeks. She simply directed. The bond dissolved. Cass stopped speaking mid-sentence. She stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at Varn across the chamber with an expression that had nothing of the witness position in it anymore. Nothing performed, nothing shaped for public consumption. "My daughter," she said. Her voice carried in the chamber's acoustic. "He has my daughter," she said, to the council, to the room, to everyone. "In the northern compound, she is 12 years old, and I have been in this delegation, because he said, if I did not do what he asked, she would be held for as long as he required." Her voice was steady, which was remarkable. The steadiness of someone who has been holding something for so long that even when the holding stops, the structure remains. "I am a voluntary member of nothing. I was taken 4 years ago from the Eastern Border Pack when my husband died, and I had no one to protect us." The council chamber was completely silent. Varn was on his feet. His legal representative had her hand on his arm. His entire delegation had shifted, and the quality of that shift was the shift of people who had just felt the ground they were standing on become uncertain. And then Dara stood up from her seat in the witness gallery. Fen stood up beside her. And behind them, because Harlow had done in the days before the hearing what Harlow always did without being specifically instructed, because he was that kind of person, 3 more individuals stood. Former syndicate operatives who had been quietly contacted through channels that Calum had built over years, and who had agreed, with varying degrees of hesitation, to appear. Every one of them was within range. The silver light did not come from Sarah's hands this time. It did not come from anywhere visible. It moved through the room like a change in temperature, like the shift of the air when a high window opens, and the outside and the inside equalize, and every bond in that room, that had been applied by force, dissolved with the quiet completeness of something that had never been meant to hold. The sound that filled the council chamber after that was not dramatic. It was the sound of people breathing differently than they had been breathing a moment before. Varn moved toward her. He was not slow and he was not cautious. He came across the chamber floor with the direct violence of someone who has just lost a great deal, and has decided the fastest way to stop losing more is to remove the source. He was not carrying anything visible, but he did not need to be. He was a large and capable and very angry man, and he was across the floor in 3 strides before Harlow had cleared the gallery railing. He was 2 strides away from her when Calum stepped between them. Not at a run, not dramatically. He simply stepped from his position to hers, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided, and the decision was final, and the finality was visible in every line of his body. Varn stopped. Not because he was afraid of Calum. He had been building power and resources for over a decade, and he did not frighten easily. He stopped because of what he saw on Calum's face, which was not anger, which would have been manageable, and not coldness, which he had accounted for. He stopped because of the specific quality of the stillness in front of him. The stillness of a man who is not managing a situation but inhabiting one. A man who has decided that something is worth standing in front of, and has stopped having internal debates about it. Behind Calum, Sarah stood and watched Varn look at the Alpha King, and she understood exactly what Varn was reading in that stillness, because she had been reading it for weeks. The 7 council members were on their feet. The head council chair was speaking in the formal tones of someone invoking the neutrality clause, with the specific authority of 400 years of institutional weight behind it. Varn looked at Calum for a long moment. Then he looked past him, at Sarah. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has understood something a moment too late, the something being that the thing he had been searching for, the thing he had been hunting across decades and cover records and extradition requests and proxy creatures sent through pack walls, was not what he had planned for. He had planned for a weapon. He had planned for something he could contain or remove. What was standing in that council chamber was not a weapon. It was something that could not be contained or removed, because it was not external. It was original. It was the thing that wolfsbanes had come from, and you could no more remove that than you could remove the concept of direction from a compass. He saw this. She could tell he saw it. Then the council guard came through the chamber doors, and the afternoon moved into its procedural conclusion, and the Ironjaw Syndicate's formal standing was ruled null pending investigation, and Cass's daughter was located in the northern compound by a council dispatch team that left before the chamber fully cleared, and Varn was held for formal questioning under the neutrality clause that protected everyone inside the council walls, which was, in this particular case, a dual-edged provision, and the hearing, which had been scheduled for 3 days, was concluded before the evening meal. They rode back to the Iron Keep over 3 days, and the quality of the return was different from the quality of the journey out, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, or the road, or the composition of the party. On the journey to the council seat, everyone had been carrying the particular kind of alertness that precedes something large and uncertain. On the return, that alertness had resolved into something quieter and more durable, the feeling of people who have done a difficult thing and have come out the other side of it with most of what they brought and some things they had not expected to gain. Dara rode beside Fen for most of the journey. They were not a great deal alike, she and the older man, but they had the particular ease with each other, of people who had shared a specific kind of experience, and did not need to explain it to each other. On the second evening, when they stopped at a wayhouse for the night, Sarah found them both sitting by the fire in the common room, not talking, just sitting. She sat with them for an hour, and did not feel the need to speak either, and neither did they, and it was the kind of companionship that does not require its own narration. Cass's daughter was confirmed safe on the second day out from the council seat. A courier had ridden ahead with the council dispatch team's report, and it found Calum's party in the early morning of the second day, handed to Harlow, who brought it to Calum, who told Sarah at the first opportunity. The girl's name was Wren. She was 12 and she was unharmed, and she was, according to the dispatch writer who had written the report, extremely angry about the whole situation, in a way that the writer had described as frankly impressive for someone her age. Sarah heard this, and felt something ease in her chest that had been sitting there since the hearing. She and Calum did not speak much during the return journey. This was not unusual between them. They had never been people who filled available air with conversation. But the nature of the quiet was different from before. Before, the quiet had been the quiet of two people who had not yet decided what the other one was. Now it was something else. Something more settled and more complicated at the same time. On the final evening, the night before they would reach the Iron Keep, they stopped at a clear section of road where the valley opened and the mountains were visible on all sides, and the sky was enormous and already full of early stars. The party made camp at the roadside. Fires were built, food was distributed, the horses were seen to. Sarah was sitting slightly apart from the main camp, on a large flat stone at the edge of the road, looking at the mountains. She had been thinking about the archive and the books still waiting there. the sections she had not yet read, the volumes Marin had still not fully catalogued. She had been thinking about the 47 names on the list and the generations of people who had carried what she carried and had been removed from the record for it. And she had been thinking about Nora Cavell, her mother, whose name sat at the end of that list with the word unconfirmed beside it. She heard Calem's footstep on the road behind her. She recognized it by now, the specific weight and cadence of it, the way she recognized most things about him, with the quiet familiarity of long and close attention. He sat down on the stone beside her without asking. This was new. He had never sat beside her without some clear functional reason before. He just sat down and looked at the mountains and said nothing. She let the silence exist for a while. Then she said, "Do you think she is in the Northern Territories?" He did not ask who. The council dispatch teams will be operating in that area for the next several months. The formal investigation of all syndicate compounds is beginning immediately. A pause. If she is findable, we will find her. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Not for a specific thing. For the we." He looked at the mountains. "The former syndicate members, who were released at the hearing," he said. "Marin has been in contact with the council about what support they need. The reintegration into their original packs, where that is an option, and the placement in new packs where it is not, will require coordination across several territories." A pause. "I will be spending the next several months doing that coordination." "And I," she said. He looked at her. She met his gaze. "You will want your own role in it," he said, "not a question." "I am the best person to confirm the dissolution of remaining forced bonds," she said. "No instrument Marin has available, no existing wolf ability, can detect them with the precision I have. If you are going to actually free the people who are still held, rather than simply removing their alpha and leaving the bonds in place, you need me in those compounds." He held her gaze. She saw the specific quality of thought behind his eyes, the processing of multiple levels of implication at once. "That is dangerous work," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am aware of that. You would be moving through former syndicate territory repeatedly, visibly, in a capacity that many people will already know makes you the primary reason their power structure collapsed. Also yes. And you are comfortable with this." She looked at the mountains. "I have been preparing for a role I did not understand for 5 years," she said. "It turns out the preparation was adequate. I would prefer to do the work than to stop doing it, because it is not safe." A pause. "You do not stop working because it is not safe." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Then we understand each other." He looked at the stars for a while. She looked at them too. They were very clear at this elevation, and at this hour, the kind of sky that makes its own kind of silence. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. His voice had the specific quality of a person who has organized a thing carefully over time and has arrived at the moment of saying it, without entirely knowing what will happen next. "About the 3 years before you arrived." She waited. "My mate died," he said, 3 years ago, in a pack crossing that was not supposed to be dangerous, and was made dangerous by the kind of negligence that should have been preventable." He said this flatly, the way he said most things, but the flatness had a texture to it that she had come to understand was not absence of feeling but a very particular and long-practiced management of it. "My wolf went silent the day after. I did not expect it to wake again." She did not say she was sorry. He was not the kind of person who found that phrase useful, and she was not the kind of person who used phrases she did not mean in the precise way she offered them. She was sorry, genuinely, in the specific way that one person can be sorry for the losses another person has carried. But she sat with it rather than saying it, and the sitting with it, she thought, was more honest than the saying would have been. "I know it was not something you caused or chose," he said, "the waking. I know that is simply what you are, and how it works." A pause. "I am not telling you this because I need you to do something with it, or feel something about it. I am telling you because it is true, and I have decided that the things which are true between us should be said, rather than understood privately, and left unsaid." She looked at him. He was looking at the stars. "That is a decision that costs you something," she said. "Most decisions worth making do," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My whole life, until about 8 weeks ago, I was told that I was without a wolf, without rank, without a place in a system built on a version of worth I could never earn by those rules." She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her. I know what it is to carry something important inside you, that the world around you has no category for, and to have to decide every single day whether to protect it by hiding it, or protect it by letting it exist where people can see it. He held her gaze. I chose to let it exist, she said. It cost me things, but what it gave me was more. She paused. I am not suggesting what you should choose. I am saying I understand the cost of both options, and I think you do too. And I think the decision you just made, to say the thing that was true instead of leaving it unsaid, is the one that costs more in the short term and gives more over time. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not the recalibrating one. It was something further forward than that, something that had cleared the processing stage and arrived at itself. Yes, he said, I think so too. They sat on the flat stone at the edge of the road with the mountains around them, and the stars overhead, and the sound of the camp behind them, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence between them was the kind that has graduated past what it was before, into something it will not return from. When they rode into the Iron Keep's gates the following afternoon, Marin was already in the courtyard, which meant he had been watching for them, which meant he had been anxious, which was not a state she had seen him in before. He came toward them the moment they were through the gate, and he was carrying a book under his arm that she recognized as one of the volumes from the deep archive, and his face had the quality it had when he had found something that could not wait for a better moment. The fourth notation, he said, when she had dismounted and was standing before him. I found it 3 days after you left. I did not send a courier because I wanted to tell you directly. He held out the book. Your mother wrote a letter. It was filed inside the back cover of the 4th volume, which is why I did not find it when I catalogued the front sections. She knew about the archive. She knew about the keep. He paused. She left the letter for you. Sarah looked at the book in his hands. She looked at Marin's face, which was serious and careful and kind. She took the book. She did not open it in the courtyard. She carried it with her through the main hall, and up the stairs and to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed with the book in her lap and her hands resting on the cover, and she gave herself a moment. Just a moment. Then she opened the back cover. The letter was written on a single folded sheet, in a handwriting she had not seen in 9 years but recognized instantly, the particular way the letters tilted forward, as if they were always in a slight hurry. It was not long. Her mother had never been a person of many words. It said, I could not stay without leading them to you. I could not take you without taking you into the running. I chose to leave you in the place you were, which was solid, even if it was not kind, because solid is what you needed more than kind, when what you were going to need to stand on your own was the practice of staying upright in difficult conditions. I watched you as long as I could. I know what you became. I am not surprised. I was also not always able to be where I needed to be, but I was the woman who told you to know yourself before the telling. I hope you have. There are people in the world who will help you now. Let them. Below that, in smaller letters, as if added separately, the Northern Valley, a grove of white trees. I will be there until I am not. Sarah sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went downstairs and found Calum in his working room and stood in the doorway. He looked up. She held up the letter. She is in the Northern Valley, she said. A grove of white trees. He looked at her for one moment. Then he reached across his desk and pulled a map toward him, and opened it without any further preamble, and she came into the room and leaned over the map beside him, and together they began to work out the route. Outside the window, the Iron Keep was going about its evening. The torches were being lit along the wall. The kitchen smoke was rising straight up in the cold, still air. Somewhere across the compound, she could hear Dara's voice talking to someone, not loudly, just the normal sound of a person in conversation, the completely ordinary sound of someone who was in a place they had chosen to be. The silver in Sarah's blood moved like it was breathing. She had been told she was without, once, without a wolf, without rank, without value, in a system that could not read what she carried. She had survived that telling. She had kept her candle lit in a woodshed, and read every book she could find, and stayed upright in difficult conditions as instructed, and waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment was not the same thing as a convenient one, for the world to catch up to what she already knew about herself. The world had caught up. She looked at the map spread between them, at Calum's hand moving across the northern territory, at the route taking shape under two sets of eyes that were, for the first time, looking at the same horizon with the same purpose. She had been born without a wolf. What she had been born with was older, and wider, and more than sufficient. She reached across the map and pointed to the White Tree Valley. There, she said. And they began.